So thank you all for coming out this evening, even though it's through Zoom. I really appreciate your attendance, and I hope we have a good discussion today. So the way this is going to work is that we're going to be asking a couple questions to Dr. Johnson, and if you have a question yourself that you'd like to add on to the conversation, just raise your hand through the Zoom participants function. At that point, Chase or Tricia will note that you have raised your hand and let me know. And then I can sort of find a lull in the conversation and make sure that you get to ask your question directly to Dr. Johnson. So without further ado, 2020 in review, it was an insane year. So much has happened, and it's hard to know exactly where it began, how much of it began this year, and how much of it began decades in the making. We have the Russian bounties, we have the killing of Navalny, and the continued threat of Russian election meddling. You have the rise of climate catastrophe, so many hurricanes, wildfires, and extreme heat. You have the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the role of human rights in the international community. You see voter suppression around the globe. You see the Israeli annexation of the West Bank, and then the turnaround with the UAE-Israel deal. And you also see TikTok being banned due to national security concerns. At the end of reading all that, you may wonder what is going on.
Karan, I'm feeling a little depressed at the moment.
It's hard to keep up with all the news, and it gets a bit depressing at the time. But I think something to remember is a lot of these things can be explained, a lot of these trends can be broken down, and with all of these things, we can forecast what happens in the future, understand the reasons behind it, and try to find ways that we as individuals and we as a society can make all these depressing news stories a little bit better in the future through our actions and our intelligence. So joining us today is, of course, Dr. Loch Johnson, a premier intellectual in the field of intelligence and oversight, who's published more than 30 books and over 200 articles on intelligence agencies, foreign policy, and national security. But even more important than that, Dr. Loch Johnson was a professor here at UGA for more than 40 years. So we're really thankful to have him here with us today, to have him give up some of his time. And Dr. Johnson, if you have any introductory words.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. And I must say, if you'll allow me to take just a moment, I've received many kindnesses over the years from the University of Georgia. But the honor which you have accorded me with this society is, in my view, without parallel. And I offer you my solemn and heartfelt thanks for this unique distinction. It means a great deal to me, and thank you so much. Karan, if I could take just a few minutes, I want to lay out one thing that's particularly bothering me right now, and then let's open it up and have a rich exchange. What I'm concerned about right now is what I perceive as the decline of democracy, both in our country and indeed around the world. And I'd like to give a few examples of that, and perhaps this will be a springboard for some discussion about what we can do about it. But if you think about it, when it comes to American foreign policy, there are three powers that I think are particularly significant. And some of you have had class with me, will have heard me talk about this before. One is the war power, another is the treaty power, and the third I call the spy power. And as you know, in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Madison and others made sure that the legislative branch had a strong role to play when it came to making war. But over the years, particularly since Richard Nixon, a theory has arisen called the unitary presidency theory, or sometimes the imperial presidency theory, which postulates that foreign policy and national security issues ought to be the sole domain of the President of the United States. And despite what the Constitution may say, or what our founders wrote about the dangers of concentrated power, there are some important people who strongly believe in that point of view, such as, for example, the current Attorney General. Or take the treaty power. Rather than simply rely on treaties, which used to be very solemn exercises, we have developed executive agreements whereby the executive branch, the president or others working for him or one day her, decide what pacts we're going to have with other nations without any legislative involvement whatsoever. On the spy power, you know, the Constitution was silent on that point, But again, over the years, sometimes the executive branch has misused these agencies, such as with extreme torture activities and so on. So let me take about 5 minutes to look at the last 3 administrations to suggest how dangerous this has become. Let's begin with the second Bush administration. In the war power, we find that, at least in my view, we were frightened into going to war in Iraq. And indeed, I would even say tricked. If you go back and look at these speeches at the time, President Bush and Condoleezza Rice and others were talking about mushroom clouds appearing in our backyards because Iraq was going to hit us with nuclear weapons. And I think that really frightened the American people and their representatives in Congress, even though in reality, that was vastly overstated, I think. And the treaty power, we found that often President Bush would put together an Iraqi coalition simply by executive agreement, promising people things to other countries that the Congress and the rest of the nation really didn't know much about. In fact, here is the description of John Kerry about that coalition. He said it was comprised of the bribed, the coerced, the bought, and the extorted, all done behind the scenes. And of course, the spy power by Bush. You know, President Bush went to war in Iraq without any national intelligence estimate, which is unprecedented. Normally, if we're going to have a serious foreign policy initiative, we ask the CIA to create a national intelligence estimate. That was never done. And then he completely ignored a number of the intelligence agencies that were telling him that the supposed fact that there were WMDs in Iraq was false, including Air Force Intelligence, Energy Department, even the State Department. In the Obama administration on war power, President Obama took us to war against terrorists in Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, without any congressional authorization whatsoever. On the treaty power, he initiated the Iranian nuclear agreement strictly by executive agreement, until fortunately Bob Corker on the Foreign Relations Committee said, no, that's not the way we do things. And he required of Obama a congressional participation. But Obama, a constitutional law professor at Harvard in part of his career, was entirely happy to completely ignore the treaty process. And when it came to the spy power, you know, the Senate had a major investigation into torture, and yet Obama didn't cooperate much at all. He refused to declassify documents. He refused to have conversations with Dianne Feinstein, a fellow Democrat who was conducting these investigations into torture. And when you look at drones, Obama reserved the right to have a kill list established by the White House without any separate judicial review whatsoever. And the Trump administration, if you look at the war power, he actually engaged in an act of war against Syria, going way beyond any other modern president had done. And with the treaty power, imagine he simply walked out of the Paris Accord, even though that had been signed by 195 nations and it had taken 6 years to put together. He simply just ignored it. And the spy power, of course, as you know, no president has gotten into such a fuss with intelligence as Trump has done. And even though we spend $85 billion a year gathering information on what's going on around the world, refuses to have even intelligence briefings, which is quite astounding, it seems to me. And, you know, he ordered the murder of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian policymaker, which opens a Pandora's box internationally. He was a public figure in the government in Iran. Does that mean that it's now acceptable to go around killing with drones public officials? Not just combatants on battlefields, but public officials. So what conclusions do I draw about this? I'll be interested in yours. Number one, the war power, I think, needs to be taken seriously. There ought to be specific congressional authorization of any use of military force overseas. The treaty power ought to be the instrument of choice when it comes to important foreign policy agreements with other nations, not executive agreements. And with the spy power, look, the intelligence agencies were created to serve the people of the United States. not just the President of the United States. So this information needs to be shared with Congress, not just with the White House. And keep in mind, just last week, the Trump administration said that they're not even going to brief Congress orally on the question of what the Russians are doing with respect to our 2020 presidential election. That's just unacceptable. Now, it may seem, and I'm going to wrap this up, it may seem a little far-fetched to you, perhaps, for me to be concerned about the decline of democracy in this country, because we've had democracy for so long. But I invite you to consider what happened in the Roman Empire. Slowly, insidiously, the Caesars stole power away from an unsuspecting Senate. Or look at the Weimar Republic, how that democracy crumbled rather quickly when the Bundestag gave war powers, treaty powers, and most shocking of all, powers over the Gestapo to Adolf Hitler. If you go back and read Gibbons, the great British historian, he talks about how representative bodies are the most important check against a prince who is out of control. And the founders understood that, and that was the major motivating force of our Constitution, the great gift they gave to us. So I think that we need to return to a constitutional balance between the executive and legislative branches when it comes to foreign policy. So just a few thoughts that are concerning me at the moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. In the context of democratic decline, the threat to democracy, and just general threats to international security, I think it's important to prioritize the top threats that are facing the well-being of the security of the United States. So with this threat to democracy in mind, what other sort of threats do you think are most pressing to you?
Well, I think that's a very important and central question. We could have a great, I think, conversation about it. I hope we do. But I think there are various ways to look at that. One can look at it in a very broad gauged manner. And one of my favorite people, and I invite him to become one of your favorites too, is the Secretary of State, George Marshall, one of the truly great Americans in the modern era. And he was asked that question back in 1947. And everyone thought that he was going to say communism is the greatest threat. In fact, his speechwriters had put that into a speech that he wrote, that he gave at Harvard when he was introducing the Marshall Plan. But he crossed that out and he said the greatest threats facing the United States are hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos around the world. And those four unsettling horsemen still haunt us and still remain so important. But if we are more specific about things today, I think there are two ways of looking at this. One is a more political and policy-oriented way, and another is an intelligence perspective. Let me take the first one. If you look at it from a policy point of view, we'd have to consider things that the intelligence agencies don't even look at. One is, of course, the state of COVID-19. What are we going to do about it? Why aren't we making better progress? Why isn't there better coordination among the states? That is a huge threat facing us. As you know, we just reached the 200,000 mark of people who have died, and the projections over the next several months are not very good. So that's a threat number one, I would say. And going along with that is the state of our economy. Think of the people who are losing their jobs right now. I was reading the other day how restaurants in Manhattan are closing right and left, and people are losing their jobs. Gymnasiums, are losing people right and left. So those two matters would not appear in the threat assessment from the CIA, but they're extremely important to us. And then I mentioned the polarization in this country. It's just tearing us apart. So these are things that are difficult to grapple with. Now, let's become even more specific by looking at what the CIA would say about this. If you looked at the CIA threat assessment, right at the top would be Afghanistan. Because after all, people are still getting killed there. And certainly some Americans are dying there almost every week. Fortunately, not large numbers, but one is too many. So Afghanistan remains a huge concern for us. And the same would be true, I think, of Iraq to some degree. It's such a volatile place, and there is an American presence there. And then the CIA would point to cyber attacks against us, which are happening all the time. We have to be deeply concerned about the sanctity of our presidential election. We know from everybody who studied this that Russia is playing an active role in trying to shape that election. China and Iran maybe also, although to a lesser degree, I think. And then the whole question of terrorism, we can't forget that Al-Qaeda is still out there in various forms, and so is ISIS. And some authorities think, in fact, if you saw 60 Minutes yesterday, McMaster's, the former National Security Advisor, said that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are stronger and more dangerous today than they were when 9/11 took place. So that's certainly going to be on the list. And anytime you're talking about a threat assessment, you have to talk about WMDs. They are out there and they are spreading around the world. And then China is an economic competitor. So, I mean, this is talk about being depressed earlier. This can really get you depressed when you think of all these challenges. And of course, today, unlike in earlier years, I think pandemics have to be an important part of what the CIA and the other agencies are looking at, because this is hardly the last pandemic we're going to have. And climate change, Jason, Tricia, and Abby will remember in my classes that I used to point out that climate change is rarely discussed in the National Security Council because it's viewed as kind of secondary. It's not immediate. We have to think about things that are about to bite us, and WMDs and terrorists and so on. But the irony here is that over the long run, the climate change may do us in a more thorough way than any of these other dangers. So, Karan, that would be a general look at some of the threats. You'll solve them all, I'm sure.
Yeah, just a couple issues to think about. In terms of sort of tackling these crises, I think a common theme that I saw is that a lot of them are international in scale. And by virtue of that, the scope of their solutions will have to also be international. What sort of factors are kind of hindering our ability to facilitate something like that? Is it the state of Western alliances? Is it our democracy itself? Is it the state of our diplomacy? What are your thoughts on that?
There's a famous political scientist, which no one's heard of anymore because he's been long gone, but he had a great influence in the 1940s and 50s. His name was Harold Lasswell, and he once said that politics is not taxidermy. And what he meant by that is that personality is important. And I would say one of the biggest problems we've had lately is the attitude of President Trump toward working well, playing well, as we learned in kindergarten with others, when it comes to our democratic allies. And we know that during the Cold War, the guiding light was containment, and that made a lot of sense. And what has replaced containment since the Cold War is now over? The Clinton administration and others have talked about democracy as being the major goal, democratic enlargement, which was kind of an awkward phrase. But the idea is to nurture democracy around the world. And I think that continues to be our major goal, and we're not doing it well. From my point of view, the most impressive leader in the world right now is Angela Merkel in Germany. I think she's terrific. She's smart and she's very diplomatic, and she reached out to us and she was rebuffed. And I think that's a shame. We need to be more friendly toward these people. The world is an angry, hostile, uncertain place, unfortunately. And we democracies need to hang together, or to paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, we'll hang separately. And I don't think our president, or for that matter, our Secretary of State and other leading people, are really taking that seriously enough. We need to build these democratic alliances. We need to help other countries nurture their own efforts at democracy, because authoritarianism, as you know, is on the rise, and we can't let it continue to go forward without stopping it.
Can we really balance sort of our responsibility to the international community and fighting against the rise of authoritarianism with the rise of populism and isolationism? We see a large contingent of those people in the United States and in the West at large who increasingly desire economic protectionism. They see a desire to increase and protect domestic labor forces, things like that sort of come to the forefront, especially in the last 10 to 20 years. Do you have any thoughts on those thoughts?
You know, I think that when it comes to America's role in the world, we have a tremendous leadership responsibility. We are, after all, the oldest democracy in the world. We are the most powerful nation in the world militarily. We have the most robust democracy or economy. And you know, if you go back to 1945 through the 50s, we were the most widely respected nation in the world. I mean, imagine comparing the United States to the foul deeds carried out by the KGB and some of these other organizations that we were competing with. But we've squandered away a lot of that good reputation, I'm afraid, by adopting some of the techniques of our enemies, such as the torture that the CIA was involved in. So I have the following suggestions for how the United States ought to improve its leadership role. The first one I'm reminded of because of Helmut Schmidt. Helmut Schmidt was a brilliant chancellor in Germany back in the 70s. And I had a chance to meet him once, actually in the Bundestag. He was there and I was there at the same time. And he said to me, you know, Professor Johnson, the problem with the United States is it claims it likes to consult with its allies. But what it really does is it calls us up and it tells us what it's going to do. And that's not consultation. So I think one of the things we need to do as a world leader is to listen to people. I mean, does Donald Trump, for example, and not just him, but any other recent leader, really sit down with people like Angela Merkel and have some deep conversations? It doesn't happen enough. So listening is the most important thing. You know, Adlai Stevenson, the great UN ambassador and failed presidential candidate, going up against the most difficult man to beat for the presidency, no doubt, at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, once said that the most important foreign policy instrument we can have is a hearing aid, not nuclear weapons and not major armies, but a hearing aid. We need to listen to people. And I think that's true. Secondly, I would say that we need to offer a helping hand. We're so egocentric at the moment, at least in this administration. And you know, I'm not trying to make a political event out of this because actually Abby and others know that I'm quite moderate in my views, and I like many Republicans that I've met, and as well as many Democrats. So I'm not making a political statement here, but I do think that Trump has not been effective in trying to reach out a helping hand. And generally, as a country, look at our devotion to foreign aid. It's quite minuscule, less than 1% of GDP, for example, which is a poor record given the fact that we're the wealthiest nation in the world. And if you look at Africa today, China's all over the place. And look at the road they're building through Pakistan right now, and how that's winning friends for China around the world. We need to do more of that. Dean Russ was a very good friend of mine. He was, as you know, a long-serving Secretary of State. In fact, the second longest serving, the most long-serving was Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State for FDR. But Dean Rusk had a lot of experience, and he told me a story once that he went to Africa, and he went to a very small village, and he was invited into the hut of the chief of the village. And there was nothing in there except a cot, except for one thing on the wall. There was a photograph, and the photograph was of John Kennedy. And so Dean Rusk asked about that, and the village chief said, you know, we love John Kennedy here because of the Peace Corps, because we had Peace Corps volunteers come over here and help us with our water irrigation, which has greatly boosted our ability to produce food for our villagers. It's things like that can win you friends around the world. Why is America admired around the world? Well, I don't think it's because of our trident submarines or our vast nuclear arsenal. We're admired because of our open judiciary system, our free and independent press. Those are the things that we need to really advance and help other people around the world have as well. And then thirdly, the first was to listen to people, the second to extend a helping hand. Thirdly, we need, and this is so important, I think, to set a good example around the world. I don't think there's anything more important we can do than that. And yet when we engage in torture, when we have the kind of antics we're currently having with really angry rhetoric in political domain, that's not setting a good example. And then finally, I would say we need to be aware of the importance of seeking consensual international solutions. Again, getting back to the notion of working with our allies, not telling them what we're going to do, but developing a relationship with other democracies to see what all of us want to do together. And that's why it was so heartbreaking to walk out on the Paris Agreement after so many of our friends had spent a lot of time working on that. So generally speaking, Karan, I think those are some of the things we need to do in a broad sense.
We've got a question from the audience. Shiha, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Johnson. I'm a sophomore, currently an international affairs major at UGA. So you've been really highlighting, is this working? Yeah. You've been highlighting how there have been insufficiencies with current modern leaders and just the way the U.S. Foreign policy making system has been working in terms of pulling out of the international system. But do you think there could also be an opposite cause where there are fundamental insufficiencies within the international institution or modern diplomacy making that is pushing these leaders into attempting a more protectionist, more isolationist stance? So could there be both causes involved in that?
I think so, but I'd be curious as to an example that you might give about the latter that you're talking about, the sort of the institutional pressures.
Well, I guess one thing that I could think of that might fit my system, this isn't an exact example, but a possibility would be that leaders are increasingly thinking that these institutions aren't giving their states enough benefits to warrant them to continuously working with those systems, which are prompting them to kind of step away from using those systems.
Yeah, I suppose there's some of that going on, but let me give you one example that I've been thinking about lately, and that is President Trump's notion that we should withdraw our troops from Germany. Now, if you look at NATO, it's worked awfully well, I think, for its members. And certainly during the Cold War, it was an important bulwark against Soviet expansion. And yet here we now have a president who substantially will undermine NATO by withdrawing troops from Germany. And he's doing that in part because he says that Germany doesn't pay its dues to NATO, which would be true to some degree. It's a little behind in its dues. But at the same time, and then Trump also says that we would save money by doing that. We're spending money on having troops over there. But you know, having American troops in Germany is extremely important, both for deterrence against possible Putin overtures in that direction, you know, Russian adventurism, and a kind of reassurance to the Germans that we will protect them should they have difficulties with Russia, which they worry about a lot. And then just from the dollar's point of view, it's much more expensive to bring these troops home from Germany than it is to keep them there. I mean, the bases and the barracks and so on are already there in Germany. They're paid for. And by the way, the Germans spend a lot of money supporting those bases in Germany, which we don't often hear much about. It's not as though they're not financially ponying up to help us out by being there as part of a deterrence. So I think that sometimes there's a misunderstanding about how useful these organizations can be. And there again, it comes back to leadership of the United States explaining the value of what the UN can do and what NATO can do. Because there really are benefits here, but they have to be explained.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We have another question actually from the audience. The title just reads iPhone, but I believe that is Dean Auer.
Yeah, that's right. Hi, everybody.
Whoa! Hello.
Professor Johnson, I can't tell you how much it lifts my spirits to see you on my little iPhone. I, for some reason, could not get in on my computer, and Karan was really very patient with me as I wrote back to him, and he, you know, he's helping me through here. So my apologies for failing to have a camera. I hope you can hear me okay.
I can. I wish I could see you as well, and I miss you a great deal.
Well, I feel the same way. I guess my first question for you is, in the form of the following. Do you feel like our future is secure, if for no other reason than we have great students as usual?
Well, I do. And when I think of my abilities at the same age as the students who I'm seeing on the screen, you all are infinitely ahead of where I and I think my peers were. And that was demonstrated, I think, by Karan's memo to me about this meeting tonight and how thorough that was. You all are, I know it sounds kind of corny, it sounds like a commencement speech of some kind, but you really are people that we can really rely on to set a lot of these problems right. And so as you go forth, I'm so proud of what your achievements are so far, and I think you're preparing yourself so well. You know, in Washington circles, there's a sense up there that when Friday comes around, it's the UGA students who are going to be there working hard trying to solve these problems, whereas the Harvard and Yale students are headed for East Hampton or some exotic place.
That's right.
So we're very
well
proud.
said. I agree completely. Well, I do have another question for you. Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that we have a one-term president here with President Trump. You've written 30 some odd books. I lost count. I've got a couple on the shelf here.
Did you say they were odd books?
30 some odd. Yeah, they're great books. But let's say that you're asked to write the next one, and it may be shorter than the others, but the topic is you're asked to write about the triumphs of the Trump administration's foreign policy. What would you say there? What good things, what positive can we say about Trump administration in the context of world affairs or foreign policy?
I think there were two instincts displayed by Trump during the last election that were quite appealing to me and obviously to many other people around the country. One is the notion that trade needs to be a two-way street, and that China was really not being fair with us in terms of our trade. And so I think his emphasis on that topic has been extremely important. I don't think he's particularly handled it well, because the best way to deal with the Chinese is not through bluster and intimidation, which is often his negotiating style, but rather through the hard work of sitting down and negotiating and talking and figuring out how we can make this more of a two-way street. After all, you know, we're an important market for China. They value us as a market, and we value them too. So we have a lot of reason for making this a win-win game between us. I'm very disturbed by some people in this country, and a good example was National Security Advisor McMaster's on 60 Minutes last night, who are really trying to demonize China and trying, in some ways, it seems, to incite another Cold War between us and the Chinese. McMaster's was talking about how they're a great competitor and they're dangerous and they're expanding. Well, we have to remember that China is indeed a great power, just like Russia is, and the United States. And great powers have spheres of influence. So we shouldn't be surprised if China's trying to exert its influence in Asia, or Russia in its part of the world, or us here. After all, we all are very aware of the Monroe Doctrine. So it's important, I think, to follow up on Trump's initial instinct, and that is to work hard with China to make this a better trading relationship. The other instinct or impulse that the Trump people displayed during the election, I think that was quite positive, was their feeling that we've been involved in too many wars overseas, too many instances of using military force. And I think we're all becoming more and more aware of that. And, you know, the people in Afghanistan are going to have to resolve their own difficulties. And that's probably true in Venezuela and other places as well. No one appointed the United States of America to be God's avenging angel going around the world trying to resolve everybody's problems. We can't afford it, for one thing, and it's just not our role. So we've got to be, I think, more discriminating. As you all know, this was initially the John Quincy Adams Society, and one thing I liked about him was his this notion that America shouldn't be going around the world trying to slay monsters. And I think that he had a good emphasis on trying to make sure that, as he put it, America was the friend of democracy everywhere, but the guardian only of its own. So I think that notion of a more discriminating foreign policy came out in Trump's campaign speeches, and I think that was very important.
Well, many thanks.
Dinar, all the best with you. I know it's difficult times for you, but all the reports are that I get, you're doing a marvelous job, so keep it up.
Well, so good to see you.
Likewise.
On the topic of a coherent American foreign policy, I think I have a question that I'd like to pose to the audience, and it's one that Dr. Johnson himself posed to me. If containment was the foreign policy that guided the United States during the Cold War, what sort of grand strategy or policy umbrella should we pursue right now? Should we be looking to anti-authoritarianism? Should we be looking at protecting the right to self-determination? Or is the goal really just at maximizing American prosperity? Go ahead and raise your hand if you have any thoughts on that. But I think it's important to kind of consider, why do we do what we do?
Yes, I think that's a marvelous question, and I'll step back for a moment and let's hear from others. Abby, I know you from class always had some great ideas, so jump in.
Oh my goodness, I'm being called out, guys. I think the first thing that popped into my head, and for those of y'all that were on, I want to introduce myself. I'm actually an alumna. I graduated in 2018 and have shared a close friendship with Dr. Johnson for a few years now. But right now I do global health and international development lobbying. So I'm engaging almost on a daily basis with the Hill and Congress on development issues. And Dr. Johnson hit on the importance of foreign aid and extending a helping hand. And so my first reaction when I hear that question is kind of the promotion of human rights around the world. Whether that's, we're seeing a degradation of human rights all over the world, especially, we're seeing, Xinjiang and labor rights and worker rights being taken away, and the degradation of human rights in South Asia and all sorts of places where, people's rights and liberties are being taken from them. And so I think as we see that problem blooming, it's up to that American leadership, that extension of the helping hand, to come and be that bulwark of just American rights and the promotion of those human rights around the world. And so I think that that's just such a critical role that we've played historically, and one that we're seeing that needs to be uplifted again in today's times.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful statement, Abby. And I would tie that into democracies too, because after all, it's the democracies that are mainly the champions of human rights around the world. I don't know that I would go to Russia to find champions of human rights, or Beijing for that matter. So again, getting back to my thesis that the democracies really are special and have the kinds of values that I think one would like to see around the world, and we have to work together to advance them.
We have a question from Isaac, or rather an answer from Isaac.
Right, yeah, I was just going to respond to your question, which basically I was just going to build off what Abby said and say that I think prosperity, not just here, but elsewhere, is probably our most important, should be our most important goal right now. And particularly, I think climate change is the biggest single threat that we're facing, because if it goes, I'm doing research this semester on climate migration and conflict. And I think that the way that we've stepped back from being global leaders in climate change, or trying to pursue global leadership in climate change, is probably the biggest threat that we're facing right now, because as it gets worse, we're going to see myriad issues, including migration, ethnic conflicts, and to me, it won't matter whether a country is a democracy or autocracy when they don't have food to eat. And the types of wars that we're seeing already just get worse when you have these like ethnic conflicts coming from climate migration. So I think that like promoting prosperity worldwide, but also stepping back into that global leadership role, re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement, and trying to mitigate those effects is probably the most important thing we should be doing right now.
And that reminds me again of George Marshall. I start off by talking about how he mentioned hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. those are still with us, and I think Isaac, just stated them very well. And there's a lot more we can do than we have done so far.
Something I hear a lot in responses towards what America's foreign policy should be is the word leadership. And I think it's an interesting word to focus on. What does U.S. leadership really look like? Because the age is gone where we are the economic superpower or the superpower in general. We are no longer a complete hegemon, at least from my analysis. And that means we need to increase the level at which we're working with other powers or diffusing responsibility, or quite frankly, recognizing that what we want may not always happen. With these equities in climate change, with our equities in promoting peace and human rights, how do we work with the international community while recognizing and demonstrating that we're not trying to exert our will on other players?
You know, one of my favorite writers is Peter Drucker, and some of you will know of him as one of the great business consultants in the world. And he used to talk about management by walking around. And what he meant was managers, CEOs, and their aides need to get off the 7th floor and go down into the bowels of the organization and see what people are thinking and saying. In the same way, I would argue it's important for America to get around too. And that goes back to a point I made earlier about the importance of hearing aids and listening. And that's what Peter Drucker had in mind. You know, if you want to be a leader, you've got to listen to other people and take into account their point of view. In Georgia, we have many people with Cherokee ancestry, and there's an old Cherokee saying that you need to walk in another person's moccasins to really understand them. And that evokes the word empathy. I don't think the leaders of the United States recently have displayed enough empathy toward other countries. What's going on in Kenya, really? And have we traveled there? And have we listened to the people of Kenya? So I think you're making a very important point. And I would also note that climate change, oddly enough, is a hard sell. I don't think it's a hard sell for us in this meeting today. But I remember being in a National Security Council meeting during the Clinton years, and Al Gore is a great environmentalist, and as you know, won the Nobel Prize for his work in that area, was trying to make an argument about the environment, and people were sort of laughing at him and saying, look, we don't have time to think about the environment, we're trying to think about this war or that war, or the spread of nuclear weapons and so on. And so we've got to keep wearing away at this issue. Someone once said recently, you know, there's split opinion on climate change as to whether or not it's serious or not. No, there isn't. Unless you want to say 99-1 is a split opinion. 99% of the scientists know that climate change is real. So it's not a debate. It's not an argument. It's a consensus. And we need to get behind it as leaders of this country and as world leaders.
On the topic of consensus, Emily Felkel wanted to ask a question, but her microphone isn't working. She wanted me to ask specifically on the topics of polarization and cyber attacks. She wants to hear your perspective on state-sponsored influence campaigns targeting the general public through social media, and what the intelligence community could actually do in countering this sort of foreign influence. Is there even a solution to an issue like that?
I'd ask you to elaborate just a little bit on that and get to the heart of that question one more time for me.
Sure. So Emily is asking about the role of the intelligence community, how it can counter foreign influence in American politics, specifically focusing on the cyber attacks that have led to increased polarization recently.
Well, when I think of the $4 trillion that we spent in a war in Iraq, a senseless, fatuous, feckless war, which diverted us from the enemy in Afghanistan, which was Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And when I think of the war, America's longest war, which is continuing in Afghanistan, but when I think of all the money we've spent on those efforts and how we could have put them into counter cyber attacks, counter terrorism, and defending this country here at home. I mean, it's just staggering what we could have done with that money here at home, not to mention using it to help eradicate poverty in this country and build schools and all the rest. So it underscores the horrendous consequences of foreign adventurism, getting involved in foreign wars, and this is one of Trump's themes, that really are quite unnecessary. So we could, in other words, spend a lot more than we do on defending ourselves against these cyber attacks. And who do you think has got the best cyber capabilities in the world? I think we do. I mean, think of our brains in Silicon Valley. We really are on the cutting edge of computers and cyber research. And so if we concentrate more on that than we have, then we would succeed, I think, not only in protecting ourselves in a defensive way, but in going after those people aggressively who continue to attack us. We can do this. But right now, I must say the effort in Washington, D.C. is rather fragmented. I mean, the NSA's got its cyber programs, CIA's got its, and on and on and on for all these 16 different intelligence agencies. These need to be consolidated and made more efficient and more concentrated. I think people are beginning to understand this, but it's so good, I think, for you all to emphasize this. It's one of the most important priorities for the next administration, be it Trump continuing on or Biden coming in. They've got to concentrate on making cyber defense more uniform and less fragmented, and spending more money on it.
We have another point from the crowd. Tricia White, our vice president.
So I'm not surprised by this, Dr. Johnson. You've talked about reallocating the budget a lot this evening. And so I was interested to hear your thoughts on the new ground-based strategic deterrent, which is going to potentially be the new ICBM program. It's Northrop Grumman just won the contract for the new missile system, and there's a lot of resistance in the nuclear community about putting a new weapon system into place because they're completely scrapping the Minuteman III program, completely taking them out of commission. And so obviously I would like to guess that your first opinion would be maybe we don't need a brand new missile system. But
you know me too well, Tricia.
If that's the case, though, I'm interested to see your thoughts on, with the idea of the nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence, how will our allies perceive if we, one, don't have this new missile program, or two, which is what the nuclear community is encouraging, to reduce our missile program as it exists now? Do you think that that's something of concern to our allies who rely on our nuclear system?
Well, you know, Donald Trump said the other day, and I thought he was right. I don't think he expressed it very well, but he was talking about how there's a military-industrial complex. And of course, we have to go back to Eisenhower for the more articulate statement along those lines. So we have to keep in mind that there are weapons laboratories, there are beltway bandits who make a living by trying to convince us that we need these new programs. That's how they continue their livelihood. And so it's always a danger, I think, to fall into the trap of thinking that the proposals they're making are something we must have. You know, the American deterrent posture is very real and very effective. There was a joke during the Cold War. How many Americans do you need in Europe to serve as a deterrent against a Soviet attack? And the answer was one, if the Soviets kill him or her in their initial attack. That's all it would take. And so we have, I've always been impressed by the French and the British. They have rather small nuclear deterrents. The French call it the force de frappe. They have about 200 nuclear weapons. But you know, 200 is enough to obliterate Moscow or Beijing or any other would-be enemy. So how much does it take to protect yourself? A man by the name of Enthoven wrote a book once called How Much is Enough? It's a wonderful question. How much defense do you really need? And I think the answer is, when it comes to nuclear deterrence, probably, as the French and the British have decided, a few hundred nuclear weapons. We don't need supersonic weapons and all the rest. All we need is enough to convince our adversaries that they would be annihilated should they try to attack us in any way. So I must say I'm not particularly impressed by these new programs. In fact, what I see them doing is unleashing a major arms race between us and the Russians again, which they don't need and we don't need, and it's dangerous as well. I mean, Trump talks about some mysterious new weapon that he's got that he can't talk about, and Putin says he's got a supersonic missile that is faster than anything the world has ever seen. This is not a healthy direction to go in, I think. So I'd love to see a president say, look, don't ever attack the United States because you will be turned into a radioactive dust heap. And remember that. And then that should be enough. Now we have to be able to respond at lower levels in the ladder of escalation. And that's why we developed special forces and counterterrorism groups and so on. And we've got to have various capabilities at the different levels of possible conflict. But at the highest level of nuclear deterrence, I think we've got all we need as it is. Let's think about how we can use those funds. And we're talking about billions of dollars here to develop these new systems. Let's think about how we can use that money in more effective ways.
And I think we've got one more point from Chase.
Dr. Johnson, we've spoken at length about covert action just in our guided readings and general conversations. But I think personally, in the time since then, I've grown a little bit more critical of covert action, and especially with the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the use of assassination, as well as with the allegations of coup d'etat in Bolivia and the threat of that in Venezuela. So with that in mind, I was just wondering, do you believe that such tools as assassination and regime change, should that even be included in the U.S. toolbox at all, or is that the kind of thing that we should always consider, not something Americans do?
Well, thank you for that question, Chase. As you know, that's one of my favorite topics. In fact, I've just finished a manuscript on that, which I hope will be published next year. My view has changed a little bit on that since I've been doing the research over the past couple of years. I used to be a hardliner against covert action. I used to argue that it really created more enemies around the world for us than it did friends, and gave us a bad reputation, making us look like the Soviets. But I've changed my mind a little bit about that, and here's why. I find, for example, that there are a number of nations around the world that really could benefit from having covert propaganda brought in. And by that, I mean really information flow. And it's hard to get information into a sealed off country unless you do it covertly. So during the Cold War, for example, we would sneak into the Soviet Union copies of Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Pelago, for example, about the terrible prison systems in the Soviet Union. And we would sneak in copies of Newsweek and Time magazine. And over the years, we've been able to talk to people who lived during that period, and they said that kept hope alive in the Soviet Union, to have that kind of communications coming in from the United States and a sense of reality of what was really going on in the world. So I think covert propaganda can play a role. I don't think it plays a decisive role, but if it can if it can encourage dissent in repressive regimes, it might be a worthwhile thing to do, at least at the margins. And then occasionally, if we can help democracy flourish in some parts of the world by providing what MI6, British intelligence, calls King George's cavalry, by that I mean cold, hard cash, if we can sneak in money to help some democratic groups and some authoritarian regimes maybe begin to flourish and get a foothold, maybe that's not all that bad an idea. But as we go up this ladder of escalation from rather benign propaganda activities and political activities and providing money to pro-democratic groups around the world, and we enter a kind of harsh realm of coup d'etats or assassination plots, then I begin to draw back. And I don't think we ought to be doing that kind of thing. And so it really depends how far up this ladder of potential operations one wants to go. And I would stay at the lower rungs. But I do think some of those lower rungs can be useful. Now, it does raise the question, and the Russians have tried to get me to come on their TV programs many times because they want me to say, oh, the United States is doing the same thing. But I really don't think there's a moral equivalency between what the Russians are trying to do in our election and our rather modest levels of propaganda in some authoritarian regimes. Because after all, the Soviets and today the Russians are trying to undermine open democratic societies, which I think are valuable, and I think we would embrace them. Whereas what we're trying to do is to get information and trying to support political groups around the world that embrace democracy and liberty and openness, and free societies. So I think they're rather different activities that we're involved in. I must say, though, ultimately, I'm beginning to wonder if we should even bother to try and use propaganda against the Russians, because, you know, Russia is a huge nation. And a little bit of propaganda at the margins probably doesn't have that much influence. In fact, my good friend at Yale, John Lewis Gaddis, one of the best historians in the country on national security issues, compares Russia to a giant pillow, and we can punch that pillow, but we're not really going to change the shape of it very basically. And so maybe we ought to terminate our covert propaganda against the Russians, and at least then we could make the pure argument, look, we're not doing it against you, so you shouldn't be doing it against us. And, you know, we have arms control agreements, which have worked out pretty well. SALT 1, SALT 2, and some of the others. I think we probably need a covert action agreement with the Russians and with the Chinese. Look, you stop doing this against us, and we'll stop doing it against you. And I think that'd be a useful direction to go in. So covert action, I think it's got its place at times. I mean, let's say that there's a terrorist group that is planning to destroy Chicago or New York. You'd want a small group of CIA paramilitary officers who could go in there and destroy that group before they destroyed us. So you've got to have that capability for rather narrow contingency situations. But as a general broad policy, the way we've had it over the years, I think we've done too much of it, and it's gave us a bad reputation. And of course, the most egregious use of covert action has been when there have been no checks and balances. If you look at the Reagan administration and the Iran-Contra scandal, they carried out covert actions of quite hostile intent without any congressional participation whatsoever. In fact, in violation of laws in Nicaragua, or with respect to Nicaragua, that prohibited covert action. The Reagan people went ahead and did it anyway. So if you've got covert actions, they ought to be carried out through a very rigorous system of review. And I think we've had that in more recent years, thanks to the Church Committee and other reforms that have been passed. Now, before you can conduct a covert action, you have to get formal presidential approval, and it has to be reported to the House and Senate Intelligence Committee, as you well know, Chase, from me talking about it ad nauseum, perhaps in class. So I think we're in a better situation for bringing accountability to this domain, but we ought to be very circumspect and gingerly in our approaches to covert activities, because we don't want to become like the Russians.
In the conversation of covert action, I think something that comes to mind is the concept of an ethical foreign policy. And a concept I want to touch back on that you mentioned earlier tonight is the concept of consent with other nations and other peoples. To what extent do they have consent in our external foreign policy, and to what extent are they able to actually determine for themselves their domestic policies?
You're talking about other nations?
Other nations, so specifically, can the United States have an ethical foreign policy? To what extent is our engaging with another country influencing their policies? You know, what is the root of that concept, that ethic?
Right. Well, I think that moral foreign policy is not an oxymoron. I think it's very important. It goes back to that earlier principle I mentioned of setting a good example, taking the moral high road. I think people admire that around the world. And, you know, when the boat people at the end of the Vietnam War were trying to escape that part of Asia, where were they trying to come? They were trying to come to the United States. They weren't trying to come to China. They weren't trying to go to Russia, because they valued sort of our morality and our high ethical standards, at least compared to those two other countries. So I think it's very important. But I think here's how I would define a moral American foreign policy. First of all, is it constitutional? Is the policy constitutional? And by that I mean, in particular, has it been debated? Chase Duncan, one of the great debaters on campus, would understand this. And the whole notion of our Constitution is to make sure that there's a rigorous debate between the executive and legislative branches, the judicial branch is an arbitrator. If we do that, it elevates the morality of our foreign policy because it's had that rich debate, as opposed to someone in the confines of the White House, or even worse, in the bowels of the executive bureaucracy somewhere, deciding on these policies on their own. And then close to that is the notion of legality. Not only should it be constitutional and providing debate to elevate the morality, but any definition of morality should also mean it's congruent with the legal system. Is the covert action or any other policy in violation of US law? And if it is, it's immoral by definition, I would argue. And then one should ask the question, I think, is the policy consistent with American foreign policy? And if not, why not? Sometimes we don't lack that. We lack that consistency. And then the whole question of fair play. Is the policy proposal harmonious with the notion of fair play? And then above all, I think this may be equally important as the constitutional provision. What would the policy look like on the front pages of the New York Times tomorrow morning? What would the American people think of it? This is sometimes called the New York Times test. And often I don't think we think through that well enough. I know everything I do, and maybe you as well, or at least I would hope so, is to ask myself, what would this look like on the front pages of the New York Times? And that saved me from doing some dumb things from time to time. So as a foreign policy, as a nation, we need to think about that as well. So yes, morality is important. We are, I think, admired around the world. I know we have our enemies and our detractors, but we're admired around the world in large part because we are viewed as more moral than certainly the Russians are.
As we draw to a close, I think I have one last question, and that is, are you optimistic about the future of American foreign policy?
I am indeed. And without sounding too hokey, one of the reasons I am is because I'm looking at you all right now. And I know the hope that lies before us and how you all are going to go to Washington and improve things a great deal, and others like you from around the country. So that's a hopeful sign. And you know, I also think that we're a resilient nation. We've had our disputes, but we're going to bounce back. And you know, one of the things you sent me, Karan, which I thought was quite interesting, was the article on populism. And I think that we will eventually understand that we have to address the economic needs of people in this country. People, take the coal industry, people are losing their jobs. And when Hillary Clinton says during the campaign, get over it, coal is not viable anymore, that's not enough. We have to do a better job at helping people like that in West Virginia and elsewhere make a transition from the jobs they're losing to new jobs so that they can have a livelihood. And one of the reasons they find Trump so attractive is because he understands that people have not been dealt with properly by earlier administrations in Washington. And Hillary Clinton is a perfect example of someone who didn't display the sensitivity to the trials and tribulations that people are going through around in this country and also around the world. I mean, there are people losing their jobs and hungry around the world. That's why we need a more robust foreign aid program. So yes, I'm optimistic, and I hope you all are too, and I have a feeling you are.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, and thank you so much, everybody else, for tuning in. Does anybody else have any final questions before we end tonight?
May I simply say, as a final word, again, I'm so deeply grateful for the society that you've named after me. My feelings cannot be expressed well in words, but it's touched me deeply, and I thank you for what you're doing with the society. And let me know if I can help in any way.
Absolutely, Dr. Johnson. We look forward to keeping in touch and hopefully doing a lot more with you.
Good luck with your studies and stay virus-free.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank
Have a
you.
good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Come
you so
visit
much.
me. See you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Once this virus is over, I'm going to come see you.
Please do.
Hopefully we can pay for your plane ticket and get you down here.
Take care now. Good luck with your studies and with tests coming up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Yes, sir.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.